Hey folks, so I'm back. Thank you for tuning in. Let's take a look. Today we're going to take a little different spin. Last few weeks we've been talking about mobile, hybrid apps, all lovely. Everybody loves apps. If you're like the average user, you download maybe one a month, something like that, right? But apps aren't really the whole story, right? They're just part of a wider solution. And the reality is, for many of you, as for me, frankly, and for us at Buccaneer, the bigger side, right? The app is the tip of the iceberg over the water, where underneath is the larger side that is the back end. Now, whether that be your database services, your REST APIs, your web applications, possibly a line of business like desktop app, maybe an Electron app, maybe just a browser app, right? It could be anything. But most of these are going to be running on servers. And I'm willing to bet dollars to pesos that you guys are running them on virtual machines for the most part. That's not the most ideal thing for you to be doing these days. Now, there are reasons to do that, but going greenfield and trying to modernize and cut the resource costs, you can actually get a lot from containerization. And when you think containerization, you got to think Docker, right? It is the Kleenex of containerization, if you will. For those of you who don't know, containerization is basically exactly what it sounds like: containerizing your different applications, your different technical requirements on a usually Linux machine. BSD has something like it called jails, and it's possible to run Docker on Windows. But today we're really going to focus on the normal environment that I think most of you have. So like an Ubuntu box, a RHEL box, something like that. So let's kick it off then. Let's talk about the top three. Top meaning most common slash my favorite uses for Docker in the enterprise SMB space. So there are some helpful links down here somewhere that have the more detailed explanations of what I'm talking about today from the Buccaneer.io website. I suggest, if you're interested, that you check them out and see kind of a deeper look into what I'm saying. So, without any more ado, here we go. Number one, deployment's made easy. Deployment is terrible, right? Any of you in IT or development know that. It's really, really not done until it's deployed. And your software may run differently, this is a bad thing, on your development environment, your staging environment, your test environment, than your production environment. I hate to say, but I've been up at 2 a.m. trying to resolve deployment issues. I'm willing to bet that most of you have too. It's a problem, and it's a problem that Docker can actually solve. So there's another side to the issue where development would often need IT support to do a deployment. Also terrible, right? I mean, one, you have two people doing the same job, which is just expensive, and you're slowing down your development team. That's not very agile. You're negatively affecting your velocity. So let's solve that problem. Well, Docker can. I mean, in the most simple case, you could use Git, right? The source control system of Linux fame from these created by Linus Torvalds, and some webhooks into your Linux server, and run your Docker Compose every time you deploy. But I like to take it a little further and kind of standardize it using Doku, which is a open source project written on top of Docker. So it's actually like it's not technically correct, but it's sort of an abstraction to what I just described. So the idea is that they're trying to clone Heroku. If you're familiar, Heroku is pretty famous. They're owned by Salesforce now. You can push them up a Rails app, and now a bunch of others, right? They can be PHP Node, and they will intelligently run based on a YML file or other configuration file. Your required things. So let's take the example of a Rails project, because that's what we tend to do a lot. In your YML file, you'll have bundle install, rakedb migrate, rakedb seed, all that kind of stuff. Now we can do that. We can do that on our own system, which for many of you who have compliance concerns in terms of HIPAA or other industry required compliance, where Heroku may not be the best choice. Or also, let's be frank, Heroku is rather expensive compared to actual physical hardware, or even to virtualized hardware, or co-located hardware. Doku gives you that. It gives you that same functionality. In fact, Heroku build packs are compatible with Doku rather, meaning that you could go to GitHub, pull down a build pack for somebody who's doing the same thing as you that's open source, and there you go, you're good to go. All of this Doku magic actually runs off of Docker. So again, it's some abstraction to some of the functionality that Docker offers. And we have found that it is one of the easiest and most significant changes we can make for our customers, removing that necessity to have their development teams or even their other external vendors go to IT to deploy simple staging changes or I mean, in some horrible cases, development changes. Hopefully you're not requiring your developers to wait to deploy something to a test server, but I've seen it and it happens and it's not good. Obviously, for my accounting friends out there, this is a good way to save costs because maybe you don't need a full-time, IT deployment guy now. This is pushing you, if you're familiar with the term DevOps, it's kind of pushing you towards that, right? To have a more integrated development and operations solutions in your wider IT department. Great time savings, cost savings, and frankly, less angry IT guys and less frustrated developers. Let's just call that one a win. So the next area that Docker really helps you is, we mentioned it briefly, but cost. You probably have a bunch of servers in your basement if you're an enterprise or in some sort of facility. And you probably aren't using all the resources on those servers. Or if you are, you're almost certainly wasting a significant percentage of them, right? And the reason for that is the traditional way to do multiple applications on one box used to be, and for many of you still is, to use VMs. Now, what a VM is exactly what it sounds like, a virtual machine. Now, that virtualizes the entire operating system, the entire environment on top of the host OS. So let's take a simple example. You have a CentOS or a RHEL server, and you VM another instance of CentOS, right? But now you have all the memory requirements, and you have to dedicate memory to not only the host, but the VM. So if you have one app in one VM, that's probably okay. But what if you have two? Are you now running two, or really three instances of CentOS? That's a lot of memory and processing power overload. And really that doesn't help your users, whether they be customers or employees or whatever. That's just waste. It's wasted resources, which, at the end of the quarter translates into wasted money, right? Docker lets you get around this, and this is containerization as a whole, right? But Docker being the leading one, by not requiring you to virtualize the entire environment. Basically, and this is a pretty kind of high-level summary of what it's doing, it allows you to have both apps running, sharing the same hardware resources. This would be, if you want to look it up more, there's a great post on docker.com about the difference between a container, which is what Docker is, and a virtual machine, which is what you're using if you're using, something from VMware or, any kind of hypervisor-like system. Doesn't mean that VMs haven't come a long way, but the truth is you're taking a lot of overhead. And I know that many of you are basically running a bunch of line of business database apps, and with Docker, you can probably fit a good number of them on just one box and save, you save money in terms of boxes, you save IT resources in terms of, you only have to maintain one box, right? It's less work. The other kind of related issue, and this one is kind of deceptively weird in that you may think it sounds kind of silly, but it's actually super important, especially if you're working in any of these more kind of fast-moving technologies like Rails or Node.js in particular. You can isolate the individual apps in their environment without a VM, right? So previously, again, the way to do this, if you had, let's take the example of two Ruby apps, two Rails apps rather. You would have a VM with one and a VM with the other, and there you go. You've now, because you need two Ruby environments, right? Let's say you're using Ruby 2.3 and, 2.0 on the other, right? You would have a whole VM running the operating system, different install of Ruby, different install of the gems, different install of Rails for each app. Docker lets you get around that. It keeps the isolation of the dependencies that VMs have, but it still lets you share those resources. So for example, every Docker deployment is going to have a .yml file. In there, you're going to put your requirements. There are some other ways to do this. You can use tools, but let's assume you're just doing it the direct way. Well, one, you say simply Ruby 2.3. One, you say Ruby 1.9. If there's any differences between environments or commands that need to be run, goes there too. and you are good to go. You have now avoided the issue, particularly in Ruby, of conflicting gems, conflicting Ruby versions. That, frankly, is just a hard thing to deal with from an IT and a development perspective. All on one box, all while cutting costs and resources. Now, I know I said there were three, but I lied. So if you check on Buccaneer.io, there's actually a previous post from last week. Many of you need to do flat file storage. You are using, probably, I would be willing to bet, S3 from Amazon, or you might be using, Microsoft actually has an Azure solution for this too. They're both fairly pricey, and again, if you have a compliance issue that you are preferring or you are required to host your assets on site, that's going to be a deal breaker for you. Well, I've been using for about a year now, and I found this great open source project that has a Docker container, right? You just install it like that, called Minio. And you can go check out the link below for a kind of more detailed explanation of how this works. But basically, Minio is an open source project for flat file storage with API compatibility to S3. And let me give you the actual case study here. We had a client who was on S3. They were a startup, so for cost reasons, they wanted to leave S3 because it was getting crazy. They had a lot of rich media assets, video, images, stuff like that. Well, we hooked them up with a DigitalOcean container, or rather DigitalOcean server, with a DigitalOcean flat file volume, which is basically just a giant hard drive, right, that DO has. And we installed Minio on it. We did some very basic, if you've done any kind of Linux administration, linking of the drive to the OS so it could be accessible. One Docker deploy away, we have now an S3 clone. And all we had to do in the client application, there was a Rails app and I believe an iPhone app, was change the S3 keys and change the URL endpoint that it was pointing to. We were able to write a quick Ruby script that pulled all the images out of S3 and into the new Minio environment. And I mean, with Docker, we got this up maybe in less than half a day. It was really quick, they cut their costs by, I think, 80% overnight. It was huge savings. In fact, I'm pretty sure in less than 2 days, they paid for the development time just by changing away from S3. So you kind of have to think outside the box, right? My point in this story is that Docker is for more than kind of what they're promoting, more than big data stuff, more than just deployment stuff. It can really solve ongoing IT development management problems in pretty innovative and extremely cost-efficient ways. So if you want to learn more, check out the link below. We are actually running a free Docker strategy session. So go ahead and fill out the form and give me a call, and I'd love to talk to you. Have a great day, and thank you so much for listening. Bye.